Coming to the findings, with regard to the hostages taken to Gaza, we found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, has been committed against captives. The team conducted a total of 33 meetings with Israeli institutions, including relevant line ministries, as well as Israeli Defense Forces, but it's all in the report. I will not go over it. We conducted confidential interviews with 34 people, including with survivors and witnesses of the 7th of October attacks, released hostages, first responders, and service providers. And we also met with families and relatives of hostages still held in captivity, in addition to some other actors. The team reviewed over 5,000 photographic images and some 50 hours of footage of the attacks, provided partly by various state agencies, but also through our own independent online review of various open sources. Though I must add that we found the material provided by the national agencies to be authentic and unmanipulated. And a lot of those footage was captured through militants' body cams and dash cams, individual cell phone, CCTV, and traffic surveillance cameras. I will go over the challenges that we met because that will help you to understand our findings also. We encountered a number of challenges in both the gathering and verification of incidents of sexual violence, and these include limited professionally gathered forensic material, inaccurate and unreliable forensic interpretation by some non-professionals, the extremely limited availability of victims and survivors and witnesses of sexual violence due partly to the internal displacement of affected communities, the lack of public trust and confidence in national and international institutions, including the UN, but also the questioning by some interlocutors of the narrow focus of the mission on crimes of sexual violence, given the range of other grave crimes committed on the 7th of October and its aftermath. And of course, the length of time of the mission. We were there for only 2.5 weeks. I also need to say that in that context, we did not meet with any survivor of sexual violence of the 7th of October attacks, despite our efforts. On the very first day, I made a call for survivors to come forward, but we received information that a handful of them were receiving very specialized trauma treatment and were not prepared to come forward. The mission was a difficult one in terms of what we heard and the details of the most shocking brutality of the attacks by Hamas and other armed groups that we received. We saw a catalogue of the most extreme and inhumane forms of torture and other horrors. But the mission helped us to better understand the context of the attacks, how it was a coordinated attack by Hamas and other armed groups, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, popular resistance committees, other armed elements, and armed and unarmed civilians. It helped us to understand how the complexity and modus operandi of these attacks, which included multiple civilian and military targets, demonstrated a significant level of planning, coordination, and prior knowledge of the targets selected. The report also sets out how Hamas and the other armed elements came very well equipped with a range of high-caliber and military-grade weapons. Interviews with stakeholders and materials reviewed described an indiscriminate campaign to kill, inflict suffering, and abduct the maximum number possible of men, women, and children, soldiers and civilians alike in the minimum possible amount of time. Coming to the findings, with regard to the hostages taken to Gaza, we found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment has been committed against captives. And we also have reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those still held in captivity. I pause and must add that I am of the strong opinion that this finding does not in any way legitimize further violence, but actually reinforces the need for an urgent ceasefire, as continuing this war will not serve will not serve to protect hostages from risk of further sexual violence. And I think, on the contrary, for the sake of the hostages, a ceasefire should be a priority. And I also want to reiterate that eradicating sexual violence is fundamentally an agenda for peace. And as the SG, other UN colleagues, and I have continuously reiterated, the end goal of this mandate is not a war without rape, but a world without war. And in this regard, I reiterate the SG's consistent call for urgent humanitarian ceasefire. Another finding, we also found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, occurred during the 7th of October attacks in at least 3 locations, namely the Nova Music Festival site and its surroundings, Road 232, and Kibbutz Reim. And in most of these incidents, victims were first subjected to rape and then killed. And at least 2 incidents relate to the rape of women's corpses. And as you know, the Nova Music Festival we found was a site of grave violations, including brutal mass murders, with several hundreds of bodies recovered from the site, in addition to many abductions. Bodies were also found with extensive burn damage. Then a third set of findings is that across multiple locations, we found a recurring pattern of victims found fully or partially undressed, bound and shot. And we found that, although circumstantial, such a pattern may be indicative of some forms of sexual violence, including sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. At the same time, with regard to Kibbutz Be'eri, I mentioned Kibbutz Be'eri because it was firstly severely affected by the 7th of October attacks, having suffered a significant number of casualties, over 10% of its population killed, including children, and some 50 people taken hostage to Gaza. Some allegations of sexual violence previously reported and highly publicized in the media were determined by us to be unfounded. And I'm here, I'll just give one example, referring to the allegation of a pregnant woman whose womb had reportedly been ripped open before she was killed, with her fetus stabbed while still inside her. You will also see in the report that there are many references to reported incidents of sexual violence with respect to different locations, which we could not verify for many different reasons. Coming to my visit to the occupied West Bank, with regard to that visit, whose purpose was different, considering that we have UN-verified information on conflict-related sexual violence, which will be, as I mentioned, included in the annual report of the Secretary General, we nevertheless received, whilst there, from several interlocutors, information about cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of Palestinians, men and women in detention, also under the administrative detention, including sexual violence in the forms of invasive body searches, threats of rape, and prolonged forced nudity. Concerns were also raised about disproportionate physical and sexual violence, including sexual harassment and threats of rape during house raids, including at night and at checkpoints. But again, other UN entities present in the occupied West Bank have collected more in-depth information in this regard. In the report, I have made a number of recommendations, including encouraging the government of Israel to grant access to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry to conduct a fully fledged independent investigations, calling on Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release all individuals held in captivity and to ensure their protection, including from sexual violence, encouraging the government of Israel to consider signing a framework of cooperation with my office to strengthen capacity on justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, but also security sector engagement, training, and oversight to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. And of course, I echo again the calls of the Secretary General for a humanitarian ceasefire to alleviate the suffering of civilians in Gaza. But before I conclude, I must add that the true prevalence of sexual violence during the 7th of October attacks and their aftermath may take months or years to emerge and may never be fully known, given that sexual violence remains a chronically underreported crime in every conflict-affected setting due to trauma, stigma, and fear faced by survivors, but also in the context of Israel, where many did not survive the sexual violence. And as in other conflict-affected contexts, there is a significant likelihood that the findings of my mission, the mission that I led in terms of verified violations, only partially reflect the crimes actually committed. And that is why there is a dedicated recommendation for access to OHCHR.